Hello, my name is Sina Masnadi and we are going to present AffordIt, a tool for quick segmentation and behavior authoring of 3D objects parts in virtual reality. We are going to talk about the background, implementation, and the user study. Finally, we will discuss the tool, its limitations, and future work. Creating simple 3D object behavior from 3D scan data can be time-consuming. Our motivation was creating an easy way to develop more compelling VR and AR environments using scanned data. AffordIt was designed to provide tools which can be used to quickly segment the object's parts based on a user's intuition and their understanding of the objects. The user's demonstration results in interactions based on object affordances, which can be used for training purposes and also robotic tasks definition. Plane ray endpoint is a work by Hayatpur et al. Which enables precise spatial manipulation with shape constraints. It is basically using a gesture-based interface to create constrained interactions. But segmenting the objects is not a part of this work. Interpreting concept sketch-based by Shao et al. Is a sketch-based interface which uses primitives for segmentation and can generate animations for the segmented areas. A sketch-based system to create robotic manipulation tasks using human-in-the-loop approach is presented in our earlier work, which also had the ability to segment objects parts using 2D sketches. HoloSketch was presented in 1995 by Deering and is comparable to TiltBrush. It is a VR sketch-based system to create and manipulate meshes and also adding behaviors and animations to them. Now we are going to talk about creating the prototype of AffordIt. The prototype goal was adapting the affordance template concept to our system, creating a bimanual interaction system that lets users pick the tools they need using the controllers and also interact intuitively with the software. We have implemented a mesh cutter algorithm to segment the objects, shape creation techniques in VR to quickly create and manipulate cuboids and cylinders, and techniques to add behaviors to objects. An animation is also shown after a behavior is attached as a confirmation of the task to the user. The implemented behaviors are these two. Perpendicular behavior, which is a movement constraint perpendicular to a plane, and rotation behavior, which is a movement constraint to an arc around a pivot. The following research questions are discussed in this study. Is the proposed technique for mesh selection intuitive and usable? And will participants find the affordance template concept easy to understand and will it be well received? To explain the workflow, let's see an example. Here we have a washer which is one single mesh. We want to open its door and we know that the door has a circular opening and it has a handle and a couple of hinges. To create this interaction, we need to first cut the door from the rest of the mesh. To do this, the cylinder cutter can be selected from the menu and the cylinder can be placed around the door. Now we need to add the hinges to show the axis of rotation. 2 points are placed near the hinges location. Another point can now be placed on the door handle location. With these 3 last points placed, a trajectory of movement will be displayed to the user, which is the yellow dotted arc. The user can now place the door handle end location, which is constrained to the trajectory. With all things in place, the door will be cut from the mesh and the opening affordance will be animated as a behavior. We will show you a demo later in this video so you can get a better understanding of the workflow. Now let's talk more about the design and implementation of each tool. First, we will talk about the cutters. A cutter is a 3D geometry shape that can be placed over a mesh in order to cut a part of it. Now let's see how each one of the proposed cutters are created. A cube cutter is created by placing an arbitrary point in a space, which represents a corner of the cube, which is P1 in the image. Then the controller position will be opposite corner of the P1 and moving it will rotate the face around the vertical line that goes through P1 and it will also scale the rectangle. After placing P2 in the desired location, the controller's location defines P3's location, which is constrained to L, which is the line perpendicular to P1 and P2 plane and goes through P2. Moving P3 basically adjusts the depth of the cube. By fixing the P3 location, we have a cube. The cube can be modified using the widgets, which are visible to the user. P1, P2, and P3 can be used to resize the cube, and P4 is for translating and rotating the cube. User can grab them using the controller to move them around. The next mesh cutter is a cylinder. To create a cylinder, the user places a point that defines the center of one of the bases of the cylinder. Let's call it C1. With C1 fixed in its position, the location of the controller defines C2's location, which is the other base center of the cylinder. Moving C2 around will rotate the cylinder and also results in adjusting the cylinder's height. After fixing C2, the next point, which is PR, defines the radius of the cylinder. PR always stays in the plane of the C2's base. So for example, if PV is the controller's location, PR is calculated by finding PV's projection on the C2 plane. Similar to the cuboid, widgets can be used to adjust the cylinder. An initial exploration is presented in this slide to extend mesh cutter shapes. Participants start with an initial primitive and vertices can be added along edges. When a vertex is added, affected faces are triangulated. These vertices can be then dragged to modify the geometry of the mesh selector. This feature demonstrates a possible way in which a primitive can be manipulated into a more complex shape. However, we did not include it in our user study, as we believe further exploration on this is required. The two interactions in this work are perpendicular and rotation. To create a perpendicular interaction, the user places 3 points on the surface they want to constrain the perpendicular movement. Then, they place the start point of the behavior, which is PG. Now, the end point will be constrained to the line L, which is perpendicular to the plane. A rotation interaction is created by adding 2 points to represent the axis of rotation. The line L goes through P1 and P2, which shows the axis of rotation. Then the user places the starting point of the rotation, which is PG. Now the movement of the goal point is constrained to the circle that goes through PG and has its center on line L. Now we will show you a demo of the mentioned tools and we will show you how they work in virtual reality.
In this video, we show the basic functionality of AffordIt. As part of our exploratory study, 2 mesh cutters are available along with 2 movement interactions. Here, we show the creation of a cuboid mesh cutter. The user defines 2 points to create a base rectangle, then a third point to determine the depth of the cube. This is the creation of a cylinder mesh cutter. First, the length and orientation are defined by a line. Next, a third point determines the radius of the cylinder. We use our system to define a perpendicular interaction. This form of interaction is defined by a translation of a component along a perpendicular plane. The plane is determined by setting 3 nonlinear points, followed by a grasp point. Finally, they determine the ending point for the animation. This behavior is a rotation interaction. This is defined as a rotation of a component around an axis. First, the user defines the axis of rotation, then sets the grasp point. Finally, they set the maximum angle of rotation that the interaction can perform.
To evaluate the effectiveness of our tool, an exploratory user study was designed. 16 participants took part in the study. 10 of them were male. Participants' age ranged between 18 to 29 years old. The study involved the use of all shapes and interactions proposed in this work. Finally, qualitative data was gathered based on participants' perception of the performance and their perception of the different aspects of the interface. The experiment started explaining participants the protocol, followed by demographics and previous experience questionnaires. The problem was then introduced for 2 minutes. Then a video tutorial session of 5 minutes was presented to each participant to introduce the system functionality. After, participants were asked to perform a practice trial for around 5 minutes. The experiment required participants to interact with 4 different random objects from the scene. The users performed selection codes in the object's mesh and assigned affordances to the segmented elements. The session ended with participants filling out post-experimental questions. This brings us to the results of our study. The figure from the slide shows the scores given by participants to each one of the aspects of the user interface. Using a Likert scale from 1 to 7, it can be seen that overall the main UI aspects of the tool were found to be easy. The creation of a cube and cylinder selector have similar scores, as well as the rotation and perpendicular interactions share similar scores. Aspects of the hardware such as weight of the headset, tracking accuracy, or buttons from the controller were well received and did not influence the correctness of the experiment. Finally, participants report high enjoyment while doing the experiment. For usability and workload, SUS and NASA TLX standard questionnaires were used. In a 1 to 100 scale, the average SUS score was 83.1 with a standard deviation of 12.9. Using the same scale 1 to 100, overall workload ratings average was 37.35 and a standard deviation 12.22. Workload for each subscale was rated low, as can be seen in the figure. The implications of this work based on previous work and our own results are as follows. We suggest to create or generate primitives for the purpose of selecting and segmenting mesh components. These primitives could be edited for more complex shapes as needed. We also suggest visualizing the outcome of the author constraint movement in real time. Finally, based on literature and this work, we suggest that interactions should be implemented in a way that they can be easily extended by combining them or attaching them to one or more objects. In this study, we observed that participants report some discomfort when they had to bend to reach an object. Since the study was conceived as an immersive authoring experience, the environment replicates as much as possible a real-life scenario in VR. However, we acknowledge that in a VR environment, some constraints could be relaxed for users' comfort. Next, we observed that more visual aid in the form of animations is needed to ease the thinking process of participants. We also note that transparency for some users affected their depth judgment. This is an aspect that could be improved in the next system iteration. Participants finally suggested to use this concept for game design, interior design, 3D modeling, and simulations. Limitations and future work. Our technique is user-centric and requires the user's intuition to perform a successful task. Ideally, a more automated technique could be implemented for the mesh segmentation. This study explored 2 primitives as mesh cutters and 2 interactions for affordances. However, it can be scaled to support more affordances and mesh cutters. Some meshes as well expose a hole when the affordance was applied. Our mesh cutting algorithm could extrapolate phase and normal data to autocomplete the mesh as needed in a future iteration. Our study, exploratory in nature, did not perform a direct comparison to a possible equivalent tool, which is left for future work as well. We conclude this presentation going back to our initial questions. For Q1, is the proposed technique for mesh selection intuitive and usable? We found that the tool was intuitive to use and with low workload based on data reported by participants. As for Q2, will participants find the affordance template concept easy to understand and will it be well received? Participants indeed found the affordance template concept easy to understand and overall provided favorable rating. AffordIt exploratory tool demonstrated to be a good starting point to add semantics to objects components. We would like to thank NSF and US Army ARDICOM for supporting this study. We also thank anonymous reviewers and our lab mates at Interactive Systems and User Experience Lab at UCF for their help. Please, if you have any questions, comment down below. Thank you very much.